Now that they have a medication that works for them, they're able to go outside, they're able to go hiking. They're just so much more functional that they're able to live a fulfilling life.
This is our humble hemp patch.
5,000 years of medical cannabis use.
We're learning about other cannabinoids.
Marijuana is grown in every state in the Union.
I'm Lex Pelger, Director of Education at CV Sciences, and this is the Lex Files. With the tidal wave of cannabis legalization flowing across the United States, an army of legal and business professionals naturally follows. Growers and sellers have been setting up shop in brand new markets, establishing business norms and negotiating new relationships with the law, all so that you can relax with a joint or some CBD in the evening. That's why today's bonus business episode is a double feature. 2 interviews with 2 professionals in the cannabis business space. Emily Feta is a consultant who has helped many cannabis companies find their place in this burgeoning ecosystem. And the lawyer Alex Buscher goes into detail about just how cannabis law has changed over the years and what it means for the rest of us. We'll start with Alex Buscher because cannabis law is complicated. There are different rules for recreational and medical marijuana, for CBD and for THC, for flower and for extracts. Not to mention the huge discrepancies between state, federal, and international law and how those laws are enforced on the ground. Luckily for us, the lawyer Alex Buscher started his own practice focused on this field. Today he'll tell us about the Cole Memo, the Farm Bill, and the ever-changing landscape of cannabis law. One word of warning, this interview was recorded a year ago, and Alex wants us to know that even in that short a time, the laws have shifted. So if you're looking for up-to-date legal advice on the business, I highly recommend Alex Buscher in Denver, Colorado. Hello, everybody. We're very pleased to have Alex Buscher on the show. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
And so you're a lawyer specializing in cannabis law.
I am.
Before we get into all the interesting stuff around that, I was curious, when you were younger, what was the first thing that you wanted to do?
So when I was younger, I really wanted to be a rock star. I ended up going to Vanderbilt University in Nashville, Tennessee. And the reason I wanted to go there is because Nashville is Music City, USA. So while I was there, I picked up Spanish guitar. I had already learned how to play drums and guitar when I was younger, as well as piano, and just decided to put it all together and, try my hand at music. But over time, I decided that I really loved music production, and actually got into music production for a while and ended up working for William Morris Endeavor as negotiating and drafting performance contracts for country musicians. So I kind of spanned the whole gambit of the music industry, from performer musician to writing contracts for country musicians.
And was that your first exposure to law and how it works?
Yes, so that was definitely my first exposure to law. The joke around WME was that all the assistants were lawyers without law degrees. And the reason is we were drafting, they were form contracts, so we weren't drafting new clauses, but we were negotiating contracts on a daily basis with promoters to get the best deal for our country acts, and those included riders, which would sometimes be 2 pages and sometimes be over 50. And they would include everything from types of clothing that needed to be backstage, or different types of food that they wanted, platters, safety specifications, production, lighting, everything you can imagine were in those contracts. So we had an extensive 3-month program where we learned everything there was to know about the contracts we were going to be negotiating. So it was very limited in scope in terms of law, but it was a really great immersion, especially as a first job out of college.
And so when did you first start thinking about law as a potential path for you?
In college, I thought about law as a potential path, especially when I was at WME. I really enjoyed negotiating those contracts. I realized I didn't want to do contracts every day because every day was kind of the same thing, and I wanted to diversify. So decided later on down the line, a couple of years after I left WME, that law school was what I wanted to pursue. And I actually went to law school thinking I wanted to be a music business attorney, because I had just seen so many musicians get into contracts which pretty much put them in debt for a considerable amount of time in Nashville, because they were presented with a really what appeared to be great deal by a record label, but it signed all of their music rights away for a certain amount of albums, and they were beholden to those contracts. So I just that was my first passion, was I wanted to go and represent musicians in the music industry.
So you wanted to be on the side of the smaller players,
Right.
Try to get them better deals.
Right, absolutely. Because in Nashville, there's a lot of attorneys working in the music business. There's just a lot more on the side of the labels and the agencies and the management companies versus those on the side of the musicians.
And so how did you decide the law school you wanted to go to?
I was born and raised in Denver, so I decided that DU Law would be a great place to start, especially because they were one of the only law schools in the country that had a cannabis law class offered. And that was important to me because although I thought I wanted to go into music business, there was a potential that I also wanted to go into cannabis law, because this was 2015, so we'd just seen recreational legalization in Colorado. And yeah, it was that was really what drove my decision.
What was the cannabis law class like?
So the cannabis law class was pretty interesting. It was a very intro-level class, really focusing on federal law and then just the federal overview of marijuana. At this point, hemp wasn't really a thing. The 2014 Farm Bill had been passed, but it wasn't necessarily a focus of the class. It was really, the focus was on marijuana. So we looked at federal law and then state rules, and also how the interplay between the state constitution and the state rules, and how there were areas of gray. And that was kind of my first introduction to how nuanced this area of law is, where there is both state and federal law, and then multiple statutes that overlap and multiple agencies that oversee cannabis, whether it's hemp. In Colorado, hemp's overseen by CDA, Colorado Department of Agriculture, and then CDPHE once it moves into manufacturing and processing for human and consumable products. So it's just really, it was a really good class because it taught me how nuanced and complicated this area of law it was. And the other thing is there was no textbook. So it was all our own research. It was, the Cole Memorandum was really what drove most of the first regulation at the state level. So we studied that, and then we looked at the regs and saw exactly how, the state of Colorado looked at the Cole Memorandum and regulated around the federal priorities to make sure that they had those bases covered and that there would be less likelihood of federal enforcement.
And can you explain what the Cole Memo was and how it affected what you were studying?
So the Cole Memo was a memo put out by the Department of Justice, and it was actually put out before I took the class. But it stated that the federal government was going to still enforce marijuana laws, but they had certain priorities, and I believe it was 10 priorities that they laid out. And some of those were using and driving, guns around marijuana. There were several different priorities, and what was a memo that was kind of written as a policy update to the industry. They saw it as a green light to do everything but what was in the Cole Memorandum. And I don't necessarily, that definitely wasn't the intent of the Cole Memo, but that was the outcome, and that's one of the reasons why marijuana has flourished in this country is actually because of the Cole Memorandum. It's now been rescinded. Jeff Sessions rescinded the Cole Memo. However, for all intents and purposes, it's still what states look to right now in terms of how they regulate. Just because that's how Colorado regulated, and a lot of other states are looking at Colorado and the first movers. So I think that even though the Cole Memo has been rescinded, it's still here to stay in practice.
What was it like to come out of grad school? And I believe you started your own practice right away?
I did. I started my own practice right away, and the reason is because hemp was legalized 1 month after I got my license. And I saw that coming, and I had previously talked to other firms. And my focus really is on hemp and then medical marijuana. And the focus at the other firms didn't seem to be so much about medical marijuana, but recreational. So because of the sunset regulations that are happening currently, as well as a lot of rulemaking where the Marijuana Enforcement Division is going to try to merge the codes this summer, I decided that I wanted to go out on my own to be able to advocate for medical patients throughout this process, because I didn't see that there were a lot of advocates out there currently who are on the side of medical patients without having recreational interests kind of pulling at their, creating not necessarily conflict of interest, but somewhat, because for every medical patient that's less price per milligram for the recreational dispensaries, and then that's also less tax money for the state. So medical marijuana is really important, and the rules around medical marijuana are really important for patients, especially because there's patients out there that are using up to and even more than a gram of cannabinoids a day, and under the recreational equivalencies you can only buy 800 milligrams per ounce. So if those were to be applied and a medical patient had 2 ounces, that means that they'd have to go to the dispensary every other day. And that's just not what we need to be. We don't need to burden patients by making them go to the dispensary every day for their medication. That's making them better and keeping them, healthier than they'd be otherwise. So.
It sounds like a really important focus. You hear groups like Americans for Safe Access talk about how this loosening of cannabis laws is often leaving behind medical patients. And so it's great to hear a lawyer focused on their needs, because you also have a history of activism and trying to change policy as well, correct?
Right. In law school, my first internship was actually for State Senator Kerry Donovan, and this was before the activism part. This was just learning the Colorado politics and how the state house worked, and that was wonderful. They ran a hemp animal feed bill while I was there, and learned a lot about hemp, because immediately we were told that bill has to be reformed into a study because hemp can't be an animal feed. And the major concern was that if we started feeding hemp to cattle or animals that were going to cross interstate, that they could be seized potentially by the DEA as being
hot cows.
Hot cows, exactly. So after that bill, I decided, I did two things next. After working for the state senator, I did two things. I started working in-house for a cannabis company called Escape Artists, and I was their legal counsel for a year, and then I was promoted to vice president between the time where I took the bar and passed the bar. So I was doing a lot of their legal work, and then also a lot of their marketing and helping with some of the product rollouts. And then at the same time, I was interning for cannabis lobbyist Cindy Sovine, and she's known as kind of the best cannabis lobbyist out there right now. She really focuses on medical patients. She's been instrumental in leading or in getting the conditions autism, or the autism bill passed, which adds autism as a qualifying condition to the medical marijuana registry. So through that process, I really learned the lobbying process and how to push a bill using good arguments and powerful testimony and building relationships. And it really is about what Cindy's taught me. Is it's really about going up and telling human, true stories that just pull at heartstrings. And there are a lot of those stories in medical cannabis. I mean, people were written off by their doctors, put on opiates, put on really serious drugs with major side effects, and they've found that through cannabis they don't have to take those drugs anymore. And some of their life stories or recent life stories are profound, of the difference between how their lives were going when they were on their pharmaceuticals, and then how their lives are going now that they're off all their pharmaceuticals and are using cannabis as an alternative therapy. And it's obviously not a cure-all. I mean, but from what I've heard, it makes these patients, it makes their lives so much more fulfilling because they don't feel numbed. They don't feel like they just want to go to bed. They don't feel like they can't do anything. Now that they have a medication that works for them, they're able to go outside. They're able to go hiking. They're able, and it's not like they're no longer in pain. They're just so much more functional that they're able to live a fulfilling life. And I think that those stories are so powerful and have really turned the tide in terms of how cannabis is, and especially marijuana is looked at in this state. And hopefully that permeates throughout the entire country.
It must make it easier to go into work every day knowing that it's helping.
Yeah, it's definitely nice going to work knowing that I'm helping people, and that's definitely a passion of mine. And now I really want to make sure that we push it not just in the state of Colorado, but to other states, because we have a large medical refugee population in Colorado of people with severe illnesses that have moved from all over the country here to use medical marijuana, because prior to recently we were one of the only states that was allowing medical marijuana for the amount of conditions that we allow it for. And then also there wasn't hemp, so people weren't able to access CBD, prior to 2014. So from the years of 2000 all the way up till pretty much 2014, we were having a ton of medical refugees move here. And then in 2014, we had a lot of recreational users move into the state. And that's now kind of where the crux of the issue is who are we regulating for? Are we regulating for the recreational market, which is the 10 milligram serving size, 100 milligram per product limit, because we're worried about non-users freaking out? Or are we regulating for the medical community, which uses up to and exceeding a gram of cannabinoids a day in some cases, not in most cases, but in some cases. And how do you regulate those two side by side? So with the merger of the codes, again, this is why I think it's so important for a lawyer to be out there fighting for medical patients, because these codes and this merger could have a significant impact on how people can use and receive their medication.
So if we could put you in charge of the regulations in the state for the medical and the recreational, what would be the most important clauses that you would have in there?
So I guess I'll back up and just say I don't think that a code merger is the worst thing in the world. I think it's actually a good idea. 90% of the code, or maybe not 90, but 85%, 90% of the code is the same copy and paste job. If we can have one code with a medical, and then with a breakout for medical only regs and then recreational only regs, where protections for increased plant count for patients, less taxes for patients, higher equivalencies if there's equivalency at all for patients still exist, but they can be served at the same point of service as a recreational patient. That would be huge, because right now what you're seeing is a lot of businesses are saying that their medical store or medical side isn't making a lot of money. So they're putting one point of service cash register on that side, and they're putting 3 on the rack. So if you're a med patient, you could be waiting 45 minutes if there's 1 or 2 people ahead of you. But if you're and you can watch 4 or 5 people in rec go ahead of you, because they can all use the recreational point of service centers, and there's only one available on the medical side. So I don't think it's a bad thing for the codes to be merged and these transactions to be run out of the same cash register, because that'll help efficiency for medical patients. But it can't just be the recreational system now gets applied to medical patients, because as I've stated earlier, the equivalencies would make it so that patients would have to go to their dispensary every day or every other day to get the product, just to get the amount they needed.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that the code merger is great, but protections have to remain.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, especially for levels for patients, that's an important one, and the types of ingestion methods as well. I know is very tricky to regulate legally and also scientifically to test to make sure you have what's actually in there.
Right. And I know that last summer there was some concern about some alternative use products. I believe it was nasal sprays, suppositories. I think there was one other product as well that they were discussing, but they pulled those off the shelves, and then have promulgated regulations which have additional manufacturing regs on those type of products to make sure that they're safe, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. The real issue is that patients need new forms and better methods of ingestion, transmucosal, transdermal, things that aren't necessarily always inhalation. Inhalation's great, but you don't necessarily want to inhale all of your cannabis all the time, especially when you're taking high amounts for cancer or other significant severe illnesses. One other thing I would say is that medical patients, one of the arguments is that medical patients are going after or want the medical system because it gives them lower taxes. And what I would say is, if you go to a pharmacy, you pay no tax in the state of Colorado. So if we're viewing this as an alternative medication for patients, then they should pay no tax. I mean, they're already being taxed, so adding the recreational tax of up to I think around 30% on some of these transactions is absolutely insane for medical patients, and it's not consistent with how we tax medication in the state.
And speaking of the Interstate, that was some of your earliest research, was a paper on the interstate legality of CBD, which is pretty tricky.
Yeah. So in over my 3L year of law school, my mentor said, "Why don't you look into the interstate legality of CBD?" And I said, "All 50 states?" He goes, "Why not?" So I said, "All right, let's do it." So I started digging into the statutes of every single state, and DC, and federal, as well as federal law. So I started with federal law, and what I quickly realized was that at the time, a lot of lawyers were ignoring the FDA and the FD&C, which clearly they had already. This was in 2016. The FDA had issued warning letters saying that CBD products were in violation of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. But at the same time, a lot of lawyers were still saying that it was legal in all 50 states under the 2014 Farm Bill. And as I researched, I realized that as soon as you make a sale, you're outside the scope of the 2014 Farm Bill, because it only allows for state departments of ag and then higher education to grow hemp and cultivate hemp for the purposes of research and education. Now they added an appropriations rider, which stated that you couldn't interfere with state industrial hemp law, industrial hemp regulations, and then it also said you couldn't interfere with the sale, transportation, or interstate commerce of hemp. And that was some protection, but non-enforcement, which is what that is we're giving you no money to enforce this, is you can't enforce it because you don't have the funds to enforce, is not the same as legal. Especially because there's a 5-year statute of limitations. So anything that is non-enforced, if they start enforcing, they can go back 5 years and enforce against you. So there was still risk, and from my reading of the law, it was clear that it was not legal nationwide and in all 50 states. And then that was just the federal piece. And then I started looking at the state level piece, and started noticing, in South Dakota, they've broken out THC extracts separately from marijuana. So, and they don't have a hemp definition. So if you have cannabis in South Dakota, it is marijuana, and then if you've extracted from it, it's hashish. And hashish is a first possession felony. So now we're talking about CBD being extracted from hemp, but because South Dakota doesn't have a definition from hemp, it's still marijuana, and now it's that extract, because CBD is an extract, now it's hashish. So now that person that you've told has a legal product in all 50 states is now potentially carrying a a controlled substance under that state law that can give them a felony. And when I started seeing that, it was a realization that this whole industry, it's brand new. People are missing things. I mean, cannabis touches every part of the law, from workers' comp to immigration to Controlled Substances Act to Food and Drug Law. And early, I think most people were focused on the Controlled Substances Act part without really looking at the broad applications of these statutes that apply to everything, not just cannabis. And so that paper really sent me on my way to start my own firm, because now that I do hemp law, most of the questions I'm getting are about interstate commerce and which states to send products into and which states not to send products into. And actually, the first version of the 2018 Farm Bill, the Senate version, had a clause in there that said it pretty much automatically legalized hemp nationwide, and it preempted state laws. When it came out of conference committee, that provision had been scrapped, and it said that it permissively allows state legalization. So it went from a preemption bill to a federal, or pretty much a federalism bill. And at that point, it was actually good, because I see it two ways. One, big ag isn't going to come in and just wipe out all the little guys, because there's now 50 states with patchwork regulation. And two, it allows for the little guys to diversify. And I think that with the 50 state patchwork regulation, some states, like we can see Kansas's new law, they don't allow any smokable hemp products, and it's kind of unclear whether they allow some ingestible hemp products as well. So any processing in Kansas is going to be much more toward the industrial side. So that's when we're going to see more products like plastics and papers and biodiesels that we've all been talking about and hearing about for a long time come to market. Because currently, a lot of these hemp products that we talk about are really proof of concepts, and they're not in massive production. And for the hemp industry to really take off, it can't all be about CBD, because the CBD prices, while they're high right now, they're going to crash in 2 to 3 years. It's going to commoditize. There's going to be a lot more biomass. And at that point, that's really when we're going to see hemp diversification. But we might even see it earlier in the states that don't allow a lot of CBD use.
It's an exciting time to be a lawyer with all of these. And just so people know, Alex's website is excellent source of resources. So we'll link to that in the episode notes. And you do all kinds of different work for these clients. I mean, corporate law with contracts, regulatory compliance, packaging compliance, website compliance, ad compliance. Yeah. It's amazing.
I mean, it's really, like I said, it runs the gamut. So most of what I do is compliance with law, but that's Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act on the federal level. So we're looking at how you're labeling. Are you labeling as a supplement? Are you labeling as a food? Do you have everything correct on the front panel of the principal display panel is what the FDA calls it. So anything from packaging to licensing to just getting the basic license to put hemp in the ground, and that can take some time. Tolling agreements, crop share agreements, those are a lot of what we're seeing now, because we're getting in the planting season. I'm assuming now that the USDA just issued a new bulletin stating that they're going to start accepting patent applications for hemp varieties. So I'm assuming that that's going to be a big portion of my work upcoming this summer. I mean, the USDA saying, hey, we'll protect your strain varieties and we'll protect it for a period of 20 years is huge. So I think there's going to be a big rush to patent all the varieties that they've been creating for the last 4+ years in the U.S. And they've also now stated that import of seeds is allowed. Import-export of hemp is now kind of unclear. It's no longer a controlled substance, so you can import and export it. The issue is when Customs and Border Patrol sees hemp, what do they do? Because they've seized packages in the past, they've been sued for it. A case actually was just dismissed as moot because the 2018 Farm Bill passed They said that Customs and Border Patrol now doesn't have the authority to seize hemp, but the issue is they can still seize something they suspect is marijuana and then make you provide a ton of documentation, run tests, and do everything. So it's still not necessarily clear whether hemp imports and exports are going to get through CBP. The law says it should, but how it's actually applied on the ground is different than what the law says a lot of times.
That must be one of the most fascinating parts about working where you are. There's the law, and then there's the actual practice of what happens.
Right. And you could see that in Idaho and Oklahoma with the two hemp busts, where one trucker was driving a hemp shipment from Oregon to Colorado, and he got stopped in Idaho, and they call it the largest marijuana bust in state history. And it's hemp. I think it came back at 0.3. From what I believe, so the same thing happened in Oklahoma. You had a local patrol officer open up the back of a semi and see a whole lot of plants that look like marijuana, and there's no way to tell the difference by sight. You have to analyze it and test it. So once again, local law enforcement is really who's enforcing the law, and just because the law says that interstate transport's allowed, which under the Idaho decision, that clause really only comes into effect once USDA is regulated and started accepting state plans. But under 2014, you still have the protection of the appropriations riders. So there still is some protection. But these nuances aren't being told to the local law enforcement. They just open up a truck and see marijuana, and they think they're going to charge this truck driver with trafficking marijuana. So it's really interesting. I have clients that ship hemp all over the country, and they've dealt with seizures, and I've had to get some of their product out of seizure. Even in Colorado, I had a client that had trouble shipping hemp and had his product seized by the police, and it's currently awaiting testing. So it's just very, very interesting to see the difference between law and enforcement of the law. And on the flip side, like you're seeing with the FDA says no CBD in food or dietary supplement products, but up to this point, they're issuing warning letters. And again, that's enforcement, and warning letters are serious, and they're legal, and you have to comply with them, and you have to respond, and you have to take steps to make sure that you've mitigated their concerns. But they're not necessarily seizing everything off the shelves yet. That's more of the states that you're seeing doing that. Like in, I think Louisiana just announced that they're going to start taking CBD off the shelves. New York City announced a couple months ago, and they pulled CBD off the shelves. So it's an interesting interplay between federal law, state law, and then what the law says, and then how it's enforced.
It's a hell of a way to do business. It's nice to be the lawyer. And so the last two questions I'll let you go with is on the Farm Bill, because it's looming over everything now. So what do you like most about what's in the 2018 Farm Bill in regards to hemp? And what would you update or change, if you could, to make it better for the businesses and for the people who are using this?
So initially I was a bit concerned about the reformation of the Farm Bill and Conference Committee, and that change from automatic nationwide legalization to permissive state-by-state legalization. I'm actually in favor of that now, because I think that it's going to allow the hemp industry to grow kind of from mom and pop a little bit more than having big companies come in and take over the entire industry. So we're going to have more diversified products. Even within those products, you're going to have different levels, different standards. We're probably going to start seeing organic products on the market once USDA has regulations in place. So that's the Farm Bill is really encouraging. It's also the first time that we're ever actually legally allowed to grow and sell cannabis sativa L in this country. Well, since the Controlled Substances Act, and actually even before that with the stamp acts. But I do think that there is a lot to be desired left in the Farm Bill. One would be they left the authority with the FDA for food, drug, and cosmetic products. That's great, but now the FDA has said it's going to take us 3 years to regulate CBD. We should have a statutory fix, so they've kind of kicked it back to Congress. So that's one issue, is if we could have a little bit more clear guidelines on what Congress wants regarding CBD regulation, for example, just stating CBD should be allowed as a food or CBD should be allowed as a dietary supplement, and then having FDA come up with the safety regulations around that would be helpful. I think interstate transportation is another issue because of the clause saying that no state can prohibit the interstate transportation of hemp through its borders. So pretty much a state can regulate, they can defer to the feds to regulate, or they can continue to prohibit hemp, but they have to allow shipment of hemp between or within its borders. And I think that last piece, whether a state can arrest somebody for driving hemp through its borders, needs to be more express and more clear. Obviously, the court case said they found for Idaho on a technicality saying that the 2018 Farm Bill hadn't come into effect because USDA hadn't regulated nor accepted any state plans. So the hemp that was being shipped through Idaho was actually 2014 Farm Bill hemp, and that interstate shipping clause didn't apply. So we're going to have to see whether, once USDA regulates, whether those seizures will stop, and if it does go to court, how a court will find. I believe that they'll find that they can't seize the hemp because it's clearly preempted. But you're talking about an interplay between federal commerce clause and state criminal law, and that's a hairy issue. Like, most states don't like being told what to do by the federal government, especially when it comes to their criminal law. So I don't think we've seen the end of this fight, and I think that continues to be a big issue that the Farm Bill tried to address but didn't address to enough of a degree.
Well, thank you so much for explaining the intricacies of this cannabis law to us. And as I said, everything is on busherlaw.com, and we'll have a link to that in episode notes. So thanks for sharing today, and thank you very much for your work.
Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
Hey folks, it's sponsor time. The company is CV Sciences, the product is Plus CBD, and the discount code for 20% off is Lex Files. And remember, the top 3 reasons to use that code on pluscbdoil.com. Number 1, I would give Plus CBD to your grandmother, because I gave it to my grandmother. Number 2, I was the biggest skeptic. Then I started studying the endocannabinoid system. Number 3, I know firsthand that CV Sciences is committed to pure science and to enhancing well-being. So when you find yourself in need of CBD from true agricultural hemp, consider Plus CBD, the #1 CBD brand in the United States. That coupon code is Lex Files, and the place to use it is pluscbdoil.com. The cannabis business landscape is in a constant state of flux. Regulations and attitudes change between every state and every country. There are new products and new laws every year. But opportunity abounds. There are so many ways an entrepreneur can build a healthy business that also contributes back to society. Emily Feta is intimately familiar with this dynamic, multifaceted industry. As a consultant, many businesses have called on her expertise to help them thrive. She's also involved in an array of pro bono work that harnesses the power of small business to help people. So whether you're a professional involved in cannabis or just curious about the business side of things, you'll learn a lot from Emily. I'm very pleased to have Emily Feta on the show today. Thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
And before we get into your business, I was curious to hear more about the PDF you offer on concentrates on your website, because it was a really good look at this world from the business side of things. And you led off with a quote from Ed Rosenthal, one of the greats on the more hippie side of things, but who you don't hear as much from business people. And he said how smoking marijuana is largely an artifact of prohibition. And he goes on to point out that before prohibition, users tended to use tinctures and pills and salves and teas and not smoked flower. And I was wondering how you felt that's impacted modern consumption.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I was really fortunate to hear Ed Rosenthal speak at a conference when I first started out in the industry several years ago. I think this was 2015. And he said something along those lines. And then I interviewed him for an article I wrote on the topic as well. And so he was the one who really kind of first gave me that initial insight, because when I first started working in the industry, 2013, I do think flower largely dominated. There weren't as many concentrate products out on the market as there are now. And also a lot of the people who were using cannabis back then were people who were really drawn to smoking and were really drawn to that, that ceremonial element of it. So him, reading his book, he has a great book on concentrates. Reading that book and having a few conversations with him, I started thinking about, okay, well, flower might dominate right now, but what is this industry going to look like in 3 years, in 5 years, in 10 years? And I started paying attention to the data that was being published by in Colorado, especially kind of in those initial years after the recreational market had been legalized. And a lot of the data pointed that consumption for concentrate products was rising while demand for flower was going down. So I think we did see, not necessarily going down, but we were seeing more of an increase in demand for concentrates than we were in flower. And I think a lot of that comes from newer consumers or newer users who maybe have never smoked before or are not interested in smoking or don't know how to roll a joint, whatever that barrier to entry is. They kind of prefer these more familiar routes of administration, and whether that is taking a pill or using a tincture or even having a brownie edible. I think there was definitely some data, and there were definitely a lot of anecdotes and stories that indicated that concentrates could really be, the big, huge market opportunity in cannabis.
And for someone that was new to cannabis, how would you define a cannabis concentrate?
So I really define a cannabis concentrate as, any cannabis product that is not flower, generally and broadly, but really, and I think the word concentrate, what it indicates and what it means is that you take this cannabis flower that has, a certain level of cannabinoids in it, and you concentrate it. And there are many ways to do that. Commonly in the industry, a lot of people use butane. Some people are using carbon dioxide methods. Some people use rosin, which is heat and heavy pressure. But essentially, you use these processes to take flower and transform it into a highly concentrated oil, or and then that oil can be converted into a variety of different products. So whether that's a cream or a salve that you put on, you put on your skin, or a capsule or a tincture. But usually these concentrate products just have a more concentrated or a higher amount of active cannabinoids in a smaller dose than when it's compared to flower.
And one thing that you mentioned in your document is how old these techniques are, that concentrating cannabis isn't a new thing, that we have evidence for hash techniques going back to 16th century India, which actually seems kind of late, actually. It probably goes back farther than that, but that's as far as the evidence goes. And so that all these concentrators now are working a long tradition of how to concentrate cannabis for human consumption.
Yeah, I know. I think that's so interesting because, of course, nothing is new. But yeah, there is a lot of people have been using cannabis, I mean, for thousands of years, but that people have found ways to concentrate it and to create these oils. Since they found the plant, it's really fascinating to me. So even though it does seem and I don't know if from the report you get the idea that concentrates is this new, huge, burgeoning market. It's not necessarily that. It's more of a resurgence of what has always been.
And so you mentioned the two main extraction techniques of butane and CO2, which can both be really safe ways to do it if they're done properly, and they have different pluses and minuses. For a business person that was coming to you for a consultation, how would you stack up butane and CO2 on price and the other things that a business person would care about for extracting from cannabis?
That's a great question. So typically, I think people who have been in the industry for long periods of time, a lot of extractionists do favor butane. I think because it's cheaper and if you do it properly, I think there are ways to remove the residuals from the final product. And there is new machinery coming out now that it makes it a little bit safer. I mean, I'm sure you've heard the terrible news stories of people trying to use butane processing in their garages and causing terrible explosions. I think that happened in Boulder, actually, not too long ago. So traditionally, the carbon dioxide method is safer because, and it does tend to be a little bit more expensive. But if you do use these closed loop extraction methodologies and some of the new machinery that's coming out, I think it's a cleaner process, and it's solventless, so you're not actually using a solvent to extract the cannabinoids. So when you kind of have this clean final product with no excess residuals. Whereas if you use butane to process it, you might find a small amount of residuals, which can be tested for in the labs, but and I think there are usually requirements on how high those levels can be in most of these states with legal cannabis markets. But yeah, so those are kind of some two formal ways. Some people also use alcohol-based extractions. Ethanol is very common, or I had mentioned rosin, which is a newer technique using heat and heavy pressure and to kind of extract the cannabinoids. And but that rosin traditionally has been more complicated to do on a industrial level, on a commercial level, because the equipment hasn't really existed. But that could be changing. I know there's a lot of new rosin companies out right now that I'm not super familiar with, so I hesitate to say that. But
it's fascinating, the number of techniques that are out there and how much more refined they're getting. And so how have you seen the concentrate market shift and change since you've been watching it?
I think there's just been so many more products that are coming out. And I think in the beginning it was a limited number. If you walked into a dispensary, maybe there were like 4 or 5 brands. And this is in 2013 when I first started my business and moved to Colorado. There were only a couple brands or a couple different types of products. I think food-based edibles were really common a couple years ago, and now the demand for those has gone down quite a bit in favor of other products. I think highly concentrated oils that you dab have become more and more popular, especially with kind of that traditional super user customer. So someone who really buys a lot of product and uses it pretty consistently. I think those dabbing oils are becoming much more popular and can sell really well in dispensaries.
Well, great. Thank you for sharing on that part of it. And now I want to hear more about your work. You've started your own business as a financial consultant and advisor to the cannabis industry for 7 years now, with some very favorable reviews of your work online. So how did you get started doing this and make that big jump?
So very by chance, I moved to Colorado in 2013, and I was a financial analyst at a private equity firm in another lifetime, it feels like by now. But I moved out here, and I really had a goal of starting my own business. And I put an ad on Craigslist. And at the time, this was just kind of, I had a completely different business vision. I did not see cannabis consulting as my primary income, but I was like, you know what, I can make some financial models and write business plans for people. So I put an ad on Craigslist saying like, hey, like, are you trying to find investors? ? Cheesiest thing ever. And I thought maybe I would get a mom who was trying to start a cupcake shop. But yeah, the first person who emailed me was a grower who had been cultivating cannabis since 2009 for the medical industry. And this was September of 2013. So right before the recreational market came online, and he wanted to raise money to expand his grow and start producing more product and open up for adult use consumers. And yeah, so I worked with him on a financial model and a business plan, and it really took off from there. Luckily, at the time, it was a pretty small industry. Most people knew other people in the industry. Everyone kind of knew everyone at that point. And from there, I just kind of kept going. And then I saw an opportunity to work in other states as the markets were being legalized. and kind of taking what we learned from Colorado and bringing that into Nevada and Oregon and Washington and Massachusetts. And along the way, I also started writing license applications too. Because as you're probably familiar, that's a big part of getting a license in a new state. There's a lot of merit-based license application processes where you have to submit business plans, operating plans, security plans, financial plans to the city or the state commission, and they evaluate them and decide who gets the license. So I added that into my business as well. And yeah, now I've been doing that for about 7 years. And wow. Yeah, I've worked in pretty much every state in the U.S. where cannabis has been legalized, and I've gotten some cool opportunities internationally as well. I did a license in Malta. I did some work in Colombia. So it's been really cool just to be part of the industry as it's grown and expanded.
Wow. And it sounds like a really natural flow to your business.
Yeah. I think I've just grown with it. Like I'm surprised I've been doing it for so long, but it keeps evolving. So really it never feels the same. It always feels like I'm working, on a different angle. I mean, a lot of the principles, a lot of the materials that I produce are very similar, but there's always a new exciting angle about it. Or even now, like one of my most recent projects has been working on a market analysis for Georgia, which just legalized a low THC cannabis market. So basically they can sell concentrate products with less than 5% THC. And it was and I've done hundreds of market studies at this point now for different states and different cities. And, but this was a really interesting one because this is the first low THC market that has emerged in the U.S. since the Farm Bill passed. For listeners who are not familiar with the Farm Bill, it's essentially legalizing hemp with less than 1% THC. So this is the first new market where, okay, so we can sell cannabis products, but people can already buy products that are low THC as long as they're less than 1% or 3%. Sorry.
0.3%.
0.3%, yeah. As long as they're less than 0.3%. But now in Georgia, they can purchase products from 0.3% to 5% in this particular market. So it really was like trying to figure out what is this market in Georgia going to look like? Because it's kind of a very, it's just a different scope. It's just a different spectrum of products that are permitted under this license that we haven't seen yet in the U.S.
It sounds like such a hard thing to wrap your head around. How do you approach a problem like that when a company wants to know what's our potential market in this city or state? What goes into what factors go into those decisions and what you present to them?
So I usually use comparative data from other states. So for the Georgia model, for instance, I looked at Florida, which had legalized a low THC market in 2014, I believe. So several years ago. And the scope wasn't exactly the same, but I kind of take that data and usually states publish a lot of sales data or patient registration rates. So I kind of extrapolate whatever data I can from competitive or comparative markets, and then I apply that to the data in the states that I'm able to gather.
To get back to the founding of the business, I was curious how yoga played into it, because it's not too many business sites that mention the yoga practice of their founder.
Yeah, thank you for noticing that. So I think for me, yoga has just really become a way of life, and it really is just a means of moving through the world, and it's something that's very much part of my daily routine and how I approach problem solving and really how I approach business too. So I'm not this consultant who is trying to make as much money as possible and then cash out and move to the Bahamas. I'd love to move to the Bahamas. I'm not saying that, but I really try to approach working with clients very thoughtfully and mindfully, and working with founders to understand their vision and understand what they want from the business. And that's not necessarily always world domination or, dispensaries in every market across the state. For some people, what they really want is to have one dispensary, like know their customers really well, be involved in their community, and that's what they want. And so I never really push people to I really try to understand people's vision and work with them on what they want and help them find a way to build a business that makes sense for them, and also help them find funding or find investors who match with that alignment. So that's how that plays in for me. It really is kind of an approach to business that takes into account what the founder wants and what their vision is.
And what do you think entrepreneurs and startups can do better to communicate their vision? Or what are some of the blind spots you often see?
Well, I think one of the bigger problems in business in general right now, and not just in cannabis, but in the world, is that investors, so typically investment funds or VC funds or private equity funds, they have control over the money and they have very specific mandates. So like when I worked in a private equity firm, for instance, we wanted to get a certain IRR, a certain return on every investment. And we had very specific mandates and we couldn't take certain risks. And we only wanted to invest in companies that were at, a certain stage and had already done this. And we wanted to invest in companies with a surefire exit strategy. And I think what happens sometimes is when these companies control the money, or when these investment funds control the money, then entrepreneurs who want to get funding, which of course is super reasonable, they tend to create companies or evolve their companies to match the investor's mandate. And I see this happen all the time. And sometimes, or like they're really focused on their exit strategy, or they're really focused on their, making sure that they create the business that is going to get that 10x return so that they can get funding. And not that getting a 10x return is a bad thing. I think all companies dream of that, but I would love to see a world where we're less, the money doesn't run the machine quite as much, but it really is looking at business and looking at business as part of more, part of the fabric of this whole ecosystem of the world that we live in. And business really has so much potential to solve the problems, that we face as humans, and to do so in a mindful way as well. But when money is controlling that, when money is like the primary thing that people are focused on when making business decisions, then we see a lot of shortcuts. We see a lot of poor decision making, or even not poor decision making, but short-term decision making. And that's what I would like to see less of.
So what do you believe can be done better around raising capital?
Some of it starts with the 1%. Some of it starts with, which of course is a hard place to start. But I think I would like to see capital distributed more equitably. And I would like to see, I would really like to see there being more funds or more government institutions that act as VC funds, but reward businesses with not only the best ideas for business, but I'd like to see them measured around other indicators. So what is this business's impact on the environment? What is this business's impact on community development? What is this business's impact on diversity or equal opportunities for people of all different backgrounds or races? I would love to see businesses evaluated on other indicators rather than just their exit strategy, and rather just like their potential returns.
That's interesting, because it sounds like the business plan is such a communication of vision that can kind of be manipulated in different ways. I guess as I was reading on the different offerings you had, I thought the business plan part sounded like the one that was the most straightforward, which was probably the hubris. Because for cannabis specifically, you could go a lot of different directions with your vision. So what's been different about the business plans that you've been doing with the cannabis industry versus the other industries you've worked in?
Yeah, well, I think cannabis just has so much potential as an industry. And that's really why I got involved in this industry to begin with. Because, it really does it could have such a positive impact on society. I mean, this is medicine for so many people with so many different conditions from all over the world, and it really has been super effective. So I think the premise of a cannabis business, to me, is extremely positive, and not only just from a potentially medicinal effect, like offering medicine for people, but also could have really powerful impacts on the community in terms of creating tax revenue, creating jobs. So there's so much potential for the cannabis industry to change the world in a positive way. And I think it really just depends on how it's done. But there's some really great research happening from a professor named Marty Otanez at CU Denver. And he's an anthropologist, but he studies working conditions in the cannabis industry. And before he started studying cannabis, he was studying working conditions in the tobacco industry. So he has a lot of really interesting thoughts and ideas about, how is the cannabis industry similar to the tobacco industry, and how is it different, and how can it be different? And I think it's, a lot of that comes back to workers' rights and, workers' training programs and, making sure that this industry is, and also a lot of it comes back to, some of the work I do, which is the licensing and who gets to sell cannabis, who gets to start these dispensaries. And it's really important that it's an inclusive industry, not just in general, but at the top levels as well. So that, it's not just it's not just all white men who are awarded dispensary licenses. It's really critical that we're considering diversity when, we decide who actually can get the license to cultivate or to manufacture or sell cannabis.
I'm glad you brought up licensing too, because to me, it seems like one of the toughest parts about all of this. Bismarck said that anyone who enjoys law and sausages shouldn't see them being made. And I can imagine from your perspective, all of these different states trying to solve these problems of how to best distribute these. They're doing their best, and it's such a complicated thing. And I just wanted to list the main sections you mentioned on your website for the different parts of license applications that you take care of for a typical business. So there's a business operation plan, a security plan, a financial plan, packaging and labeling, branding and marketing plan, facility design, cultivation and manufacturing processing procedures, a distribution plan, and a compliance and safety plan. And those are probably different for every state. So how do you do it?
I mean, it's a long process and it's a lot of work. And really these applications often end up being hundreds of pages of written materials. And so it really is a lot. It really is a lot of effort. And, and this is my business, so I have nothing bad to say. I think the commission surely need to make sure that these businesses, if they're going to give someone a license and give someone permission to cultivate cannabis, they definitely want to make sure that they have a plan in place, that they know where they're going to put the security cameras. They know who they're going to hire. They know, what kind of cannabis they're going to cultivate. They have the funding. Absolutely. It's super important that, someone proves that they're capable of running this business before they're awarded a license. So that's why I do think there's a lot of pros to the process and to the merit-based license application process. But unfortunately, what does happen with this license application process sometimes is it ends up being very expensive. So it's a high barrier to entry to get into. So it does end up excluding, people who aren't independently wealthy or people who don't have, and it's also very risky too. Like in a lot of these states, I mean, sometimes like in Maryland in the first round of license applications, they only gave out 15 cultivating licenses. In Georgia, they're only giving out 6. So it's a risky process and it's very time consuming and it can be expensive if you do work with a consultant. So I do think that that's kind of the snare that I do find, us caught in, because of course you want to make sure that these businesses are prepared to go into this. But it does end up being a very risky process to apply for people who, if you're not independently wealthy, if you don't really have the money to risk, on on the chance that you won't get the license, it's challenging. So I hope that's an even view. I see both sides of it. Definitely, I see the pros of the government and the commission, making sure that they're awarding the licenses to people who are really prepared for it. But also I see the cons of, putting this huge barrier to entry into getting involved in starting a business.
I was curious about different states have all these different rules. Are there different rules that you've seen in states that you thought were really particularly helpful or moving in the right direction? Or conversely, have you seen other things in states where like, oh, that's not something that should be spread around more? Of all these, state experiments, as they call them, are there any ones you think are going particularly well or poorly?
Yeah, absolutely. I think Missouri. Missouri did really well because what they did in terms of actually creating regulations is they just copied from all the other states that had done it well. So they took the best parts of the Colorado laws, they took the best parts of the Oregon laws. They, not all of it, but they just kind of combined, and I think that they really paid attention when establishing the regulations for the state. And I forget the exact number of how many licenses that they awarded, but it was enough. It was enough where it wasn't going to become this, oligopoly that we've seen in other states like Maryland or Florida. So I think that was definitely, I would say that was from a government perspective, that was an effective way to establish the regulations, paying attention to what has failed in other states and what has worked and what has been effective. We'll see how this Georgia market unfolds. I personally don't think, I don't necessarily, I think 5% THC is a pretty low limit. And I think what it might end up doing is just creating a lot of highly diluted products that are not as effective as products that can have, higher levels of THC. So we'll see. I don't want to be too pessimistic about it, but I do hope that market evolves to kind of be more inclusive of other cannabis products and higher levels of THC, especially because I think the research is really starting to show that it's not like, for a long time, the way it seemed in the United States, that THC was, the psychoactive, like bad, misbehaving sister, and CBD was like the medicinal friendly, like home at 11 one. And I think they were kind of positioned as these, THC was like the demon molecule, the one that makes you high. But now a lot of the research is indicating that no, THC actually can have really powerful effects on pain, on chronic pain, and also that these two molecules work together and synergistically. And so I think, kind of artificially limiting the amount of THC in a product, to me, that's the old paradigm, and that's the wrong paradigm. I think absolutely there should be products that are tested and have low levels of THC that don't have psychoactive effects for patients who seek that, but to just kind of artificially put a cap on the THC levels, to me, that's the wrong way to move forward in this industry.
So hopefully this is the camel's nose under the tent.
Yes.
Another thing you do for businesses that sounds intriguing is IR, investor relations. And is there anything special that you tend to advise about for cannabis companies who are trying to appeal to their investors and communicate with them? Or is it pretty business as usual at this level of the business world, and it's just one more commodity?
Yeah, so I think it is really important that businesses communicate regularly with their investors, because a lot of times these businesses take several months to a year or more than a year to be profitable. And that's not unusual, and that's not wrong, especially when you're looking at cannabis cultivation facilities. You've got several months of build out to get the facility where it needs to be able to grow these plants. And then you have at least 4 months of growing the plants, going through the vegetative cycle, 2 months of the flowering cycle, and then you have another month of drying, curing, and getting the plants ready to be sold. even more if you want to make them into concentrates. So there is a several month period where these businesses are going to be losing a lot of money. So I think it's important that, well, first of all, that investors know that up front and that that's communicated. But I think it also is important that businesses are regularly evaluating their data, evaluating their sales, and making the best decisions, and then communicating that effectively to investors. Because you don't want you want to reach out to your investors. You don't want your investors calling you. So that's really why I kind of started offering that service, because I think especially as business owners, when you're running these businesses, I mean, there's just such long days, such long hours, so many fires to put out, so many problems that can come up. So I think, outsourcing that process of, all right, quarterly, we're going to send out, we're just going to send out this update to our investors, or maybe it's monthly, whatever you decide on. But I think it is really important to work out some sort of strategy for communication. And also, and beyond, and the investor relations is only one element of that. For me, that process also involves looking at the point of sale data and figuring out, what products are selling well, what products are not selling so well, evaluating what the next phase in the business is, whether we need to do another build out, whether we need to, actually reduce the amount of product. If you're overproducing, that rarely happens, but it's good to evaluate every once in a while. What's the new direction for the business to what's the next step, and how do you keep growing this business effectively?
So your IR can almost be a way for the company to sit back and reflect on themselves and what they are thinking for the future and how to communicate that.
Exactly. Yeah. So I think part of my work as a consultant, and especially with these clients who I've worked with for a number of years throughout the license application process and the capital raising process, and so I just like to kind of stay in their back pocket and say, hey guys, let's look at the data. Let's sit down. Let's reflect how things have been going for the past few months. Let's see what the next step is. I think that's really important for business owners to do, and I think sometimes it can be overlooked in that day-to-day, when you're just bustling around, managing the day-to-day activities. It's less of that, let's take a step back, reflect, look at how everything's going, and create a plan for the future.
Wow. Funny how easy it is to forget where the money's coming from.
Right, exactly.
I also thought it was intriguing that you also advise investors who are interested in the cannabis world, and a number of good reviews there, people saying how much you help them wrap their heads around it. Do the people that come to you for help on investing in the cannabis world, do they tend to be more the open-hearted ones who believe in the plan? Or is it a lot of steely-eyed business types who see an opportunity and are willing to tolerate some additional risk?
I've definitely seen both. I think what's interesting about cannabis is it really or cannabis as medicine especially, is that, like chronic pain or post-traumatic stress disorder or even, epilepsy, these conditions do not discriminate. So it's very unusual to meet a person who hasn't had either a personal, experience with something that or anxiety or depression, whatever it is, who's had like a personal connection to the cannabis plant, or knows someone in their life who has benefited from it massively. I think it's actually becoming more and more unusual to meet someone who hasn't heard a positive story like that. So I keep an open mind. I keep an open mind when I'm working with investors, and usually there is a bit of both. There is, okay, well, obviously we want to invest in a profitable business, but I think people are really universally impacted by cannabis, if not personally, within their immediate family or friend networks.
Well, that's really heartening to hear, actually. Do these investors, do you feel like they come with pretty reasonable expectations, or there's sometimes you hear certain unrealistic expectations over and over again about the cannabis industry?
Yeah, I think what happens sometimes is I'll have conversations with investors who may have invested maybe in tech companies or real estate, and so they have like a certain fixed mindset of how a business evolves and kind of the risks associated with it. But with cannabis, you just have so many more factors and variables that go into it, because first of all, these are living, breathing plants, in an agricultural facility. A lot of things can go wrong, and a lot of things can fluctuate as well. So I think having that standardized, or that mindset around tech, or that mindset around real estate, I think that's definitely something that, some of those expectations need to shift, and there needs to be this acceptance that, okay, there's a lot more fluctuating variables here. There's a lot more legal risk here. And there's also a lot, there's market risk too. We don't always know how a dispensary is going to perform. And things like the location can in fact impact it a lot. Sometimes there can be, an oversaturation of product in the marketplace. This happens in Colorado every October, where there's a ton of product, a ton of flower that's grown outdoors in Pueblo. And, it gets to Denver, it gets to Boulder, and, the prices of flower drop dramatically, of wholesale flower at least. So I think there's just a lot of moving pieces. And because it's still a relatively new industry, we don't know how things are always going to unfold, especially in these newer states where we don't know, how many licenses are going to be out there, how many stores are going to be out there. So I think there's just a lot more variables that need to be talked through before someone is, if someone doesn't really understand cannabis. I think there's a lot of things to understand to make sure that they're comfortable with the investment and the risk involved.
A lot of information to share, probably.
Exactly.
And finally, in the social impact area of your business, you've written fairly provocatively, traditional charity is dead. We must start using business as a tool to empower individuals to create changes with their own community. And so you offer pro bono services to agricultural projects around the world as well. So was this a goal of yours from the beginning? And how did you go about implementing this?
So, I think I'd always been interested in international agricultural projects, and I'd always traveled the world, and not always, but for the past several years, I had traveled pretty extensively in Latin America and parts of Africa, and I really saw, I think I've always seen opportunities to infuse capital into certain projects, and being able to see really transformative results. So a few years ago, I lived in Mexico for a couple months, and I worked for a nonprofit called Grupo Bolsas, and they work in rural regions of Michoacan and essentially help farmers who used to be in the corn industry and used to sell corn, but kind of after NAFTA, that industry really got decimated, and they help them form cooperatives and kind of rebuild their agricultural industries. So I was really fortunate to work with this nonprofit, and one of the main projects we worked on was kind of raising the funds and getting funds to build a fish freezer, like a big fish freezer and a fish plant, which really I think in the end it ended up, maybe it was $20,000, $30,000, but it really had the potential to change the lives of so many people in this community. So they already had a lake and they were already fishing, but they could only fish what they really had no way of getting the fish to a market, so they would either have to eat it or give it away essentially. But once they were able to get this fish freezer plant and be able to freeze the fish, it created jobs within the cooperative. And then, they were able to get a truck and start bringing the frozen fish to markets outside of in other cities and sell the fish. So I think for me, it's really inspiring to see how, relatively small infusions of capital in very specific projects can transform the lives of so many people. And so that's something that I care a lot about, and that I want to keep being able to do through my business, and bringing my expertise and into new projects, and working with local people, of course, who understand the local culture and the local business and what's possible. But it's really something that I am very passionate about, and it goes along the lines with my whole, my earlier kind of comment on how do we choose to use capital? Where do we choose to put it? And how can we use business? How can we use finance? How can we use this to create a more equitable world?
Wow, that's great. And it's all business at these different levels, that you go from these smaller projects to the gigantic ones, and it's still the same flow of, getting a job done, getting a business working.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it really is, for me, I love to move past the handout model. I'd love to move past the, okay, well, let's give these people $10,000 to feed them, or not that there isn't a need for traditional charity. I think maybe my website is a little dated in that sense. I do believe, of course, that there is a space for that too. But I would really like to see a shift in using business to create opportunities and create jobs and create places for people to work. And because not only does that change people's economic and financial situations and quality of life, but it's also about creating dignity. And a lot of people just, we really have one, in some ways, a genetic lottery to be born in a place where we have a lot of work opportunities in the U.S. But not everyone has that. But there still can be very smart, very hardworking, very industrious. So it really just is about moving capital around the world to create more opportunities.
And so the very last item, besides your pro bono work in your business, you also started a new podcast that's going really well. Can you tell us a little bit about your podcast through the Agricultural Genomics Foundation?
Yes, I'd love to. Thank you for asking. So the podcast is called Cannabis Science Today, and it's actually a project I'm working on with a friend of mine, Daniela Vergara, who is a scientist at CU Boulder, a biologist, and she runs a foundation called the Agricultural Genomics Foundation. And her goal is really to put scientific research that happens at universities out into the mainstream, out into the public. And because of my work within the industry, we partnered up and we've just been trying to collaborate and say, there's so much good research happening at these universities, so much good research happening at CU Boulder. How do we take this research and get it into someone shopping at a dispensary? How do we get this research into, the ears of a bud tender? So that has been our mission for the past year. And as part of that, we created a podcast and it's a conversational podcast, so similar to this, where I interview different scientists and physicians who study cannabis in different ways. So we have neuroscientists, psychologists, physicians, biologists, and the goal is really just to understand cannabis as a plant and how it can be used as medicine. So we have a lot of good episodes up right now, and for season 2, I'm kind of expanding the theme beyond cannabis, and we'll be talking about some other plant-based medicines or we'll be talking about the psychedelic model more and how it can be used for healing trauma, healing pain. So it's all along the similar themes, but really it's just about providing science-based education that often happens, in these ivory towers at universities, and bringing it out to the people who need it most, who are patients or caregivers or, just curious about cannabis.
Yeah, it's a great show, and it's a great array of guests that you have. So everyone listening will have links to Emily's show in the notes, as well as to her business and some other things she's done. So I just want to say thank you so much for taking the time to share on the business side of cannabis.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for tuning in. To listen to other episodes, find us at pluscbdoil.com or on YouTube or on all the podcast platforms. Subscribe to the CV Sciences YouTube channel to see each new episode. And if you'd like to buy any of our fine products, use the coupon code Lex Files for 25% off. If you have any questions, compliments, or suggestions, feel free to write me at research@cvsciences.com or follow the podcast on Twitter at The Lex Files Show. If you enjoyed this program, please rate us on iTunes or share a link to your social media. It means a lot to us. The Lex Files is produced by Matt Payne. Our chief advisor is Amabel Dela Cruz. The music is by Jake Bradford Sharp. The YouTube videos are by Brendan Cleek. And our sponsor is CV Sciences, makers of America's favorite CBD oil. Remember the coupon code LEXFILES. And I'm Lex Pelger, signing off.